My name is Barbara Birkett, and I'm really honored to chair this Q&A on the war and weapons issue at this conference. We are very fortunate to have two former disarmament ambassadors who will be here to answer questions. Doug Roche, who I've just heard, and who really needs no introduction, as he's also written 22 books, and as he says, has spoken from coast to coast, and started the Middle Powers Initiative, and is well known to many of us. And Peggy Mason, who is also a disarmament ambassador, now head of the Rideau Institute, and has great knowledge on peacekeeping development and peacekeeping forces. So we're looking forward to hear their opinions. And if you have questions, I'm asking if you keep them relatively short. So we'll see. First of all, Peggy, did you have anything that you wanted to start off with, or?
Thank you very much. Perhaps I might just start by picking up where Doug Roche left off, and that was the appeal to civil society. I guess what I'd like to say, offer a bit of hope here, is that Canadian civil society support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has already made a difference. We went from the Prime Minister ridiculing the treaty during the negotiation process, calling it sort of useless, to a statement by the Foreign Minister in February at the Geneva Conference on Disarmament, where she acknowledged the importance of the treaty and the legitimate frustration of the international community behind it. So that's a recognition of the fact that they were getting enough heat that they had to change this intolerable position of denigrating and dismissing the treaty. So I would really urge civil society to keep up the pressure in all of the regular ways, but in particular focusing on local MPs, asking for meetings with local MPs, writing to them, always copying the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister as well, writing letters to the editor. I mean, we do have a big problem with respect to the lack of knowledge in the media. That's a big change from the Cold War, where there was such a lot of expertise. Now, many journalists just don't have the background. A bright spot, Elizabeth Renzetti at the Globe and Mail. Others of you may be familiar in your own home areas with experts. One of the things you can do is put journalists in touch with experts on these issues. So there's a lot. I mean, civil society can really, really make a difference here. And so that's the message I want to get across, although of course I'm not in any way minimizing the challenges ahead of us. And I very much look forward to questions and comments from the audience. And I hope people, for my sake, because I will just say who you are, so I know who's asking the question. Thank you.
Doug, did you want to add anything to that before we take questions from the audience? Or, anybody have a question? Yes?
I got a comment. My name is Frank Griffiths. Excuse me. My comment has to do with the ignorance that persists about a simple thing. I'd say it's simple, but it's the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. Nobody really seems to understand what this is all about. We casually use the word, which I think should be banned, as we talk of nukes and the use of nukes. As though these were kind of toys or something you could be casual about. These things are horrific in their consequences. We have no idea as a society in Canada and what this is all about, what we are toying with. And I think there's a place here for civil society activists, I think, to get together and to promote research and conversation on nuclear weapons effects. Maybe even go back to history a bit to think of the bomb shelter manuals that were distributed everywhere in Canada and how to have your own blast shelter. Who knows anything about nuclear blast effects right now in Canada? Very few. I think our discussion, in other words, needs to be grounded. That's it.
Yes, Dorothy?
Hi, I'm Dorothy Golden Rosenberg, and I have been a voice of women for peace for, I think, 50 years. I'm very old. But I've also worked with Meta a lot, and I was in Project Plowshares in Montreal. So I've got a long history, and Doug, you've always been a wonderful inspiration. And Peggy, now you've added to that. I have 2 points. One is how we can inform more people about the effects of nuclear weapons. In the 1980s, I was at the National Film Board in Montreal, and we made a film called If You Love This Planet. Some of you here may recall that, where Dr. Helen Caldicott went through all the details about what would happen in the different concentric circles of a nuclear bomb. And she used the examples of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we're way beyond that now. So that was my recommendation. The film is online. It's a National Film Board film. I wrote a whole booklet that goes with it. But this is going back into the 80s. So we now have a tool that can be drawn upon. And she's wonderful. Those of you who've seen the film, Helen Caldicott is so good at communication. And there's funny moments in it where she tells people to take the diapers off the babies and put them in Congress and let them run around. But she's got some very good, she likened it, but the disaster effects are there. My question is, Chrystia Freeland is my member of parliament. And we have gone to see her on climate change through our Just Earth group. And I'm just wondering what Chrystia herself, I'm glad to hear, Peggy, that she has changed her tone. But she's reflecting what the cabinet says. I mean, they have meetings and they decide. What would be the most strategic ways, because Brandon Gombe and I are going to go, and we have some constituents. We're her constituents, and we go and meet people in her office. Sometimes she's not there when she's supposed to be because she's traveling. What would you say are the most important points to make, in addition to what we've heard today, but in terms of the Liberal Party and their strategies?
Doug, you want to answer that? No, Peggy, you want to do that?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, with respect to the impacts, and I totally agree with this lack of knowledge, but it should be, I mean, that's against the backdrop, though, of it was the focus on humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons that actually drove the international campaign. That was a key element that civil society and governments joined together on, and it ultimately led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So it really, really is key. But clearly there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And I think it's worthwhile to recall, although it does show the scale of the task, that even though there was such a focus on the impact during the Cold War, the terrible impact of the use of nuclear weapons, the message still hadn't gotten out to everybody. And there's an apocryphal story about Ronald Reagan's wife, before Ronald Reagan's conversion, discovering that he really did want to pursue nuclear disarmament, that Nancy Reagan actually saw the movie The Longest Day, which shows, it's about the end of the world, the use of nuclear weapons, and the kind of inevitability. One side, they're afraid that one side's going to use, the other side responds. And that movie, I mean, it was very surprising for all of us who were involved in the issue, because we thought it was self-evident that that's what would happen. But it turned out that there were still a huge number of people, at least in the United States, that were not aware. So this is really an area where film, social media should help here. We really need to think about short films, YouTube videos, all of this kind of thing, talking, also podcasts, extremely popular with millennials, actually having someone talk through, here are the impacts step by step. With respect to what to do with respect to Foreign Minister Freeland, for those of you who are her constituents, I mean, we know that she felt the heat. We actually know that she said to officials, "I need something, give me something," and of course they've responded with this long, complicated, going nowhere fictional material effort, which would be wonderful if it actually was going somewhere, but isn't. So I guess what I would say is, don't over-strategize it. Just keep the heat up. Say that it is absolutely unacceptable. The current position is unacceptable. And in fact, I suppose one could be more specific in terms of the only role, I would finesse nuclear deterrence. There is one role for nuclear deterrence, and that is to deter the use by anyone until we get rid of the nukes. So I would say that is the only respectable, and actually the only way that a non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT, like Canada, can actually live up to its obligations. Make it absolutely clear that the only possible role for nuclear weapons until we get rid of them is to deter their use by anyone, which means no first use, and it means no lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. That's what the new Trump posture does. It is so bad that President Putin has spoken out against it, saying it is insane to talk about lowering the threshold for use of nuclear weapons. Of course, that part of his speech has not been covered, but that's what he said.
Thank you.
Dorothy, thank you. It's really wonderful to see you again, and Franklin Griffiths too. I subscribe to everything that Peggy said. I only want to add this word with meeting the Honorable Chrystia Freeland, to whom I pay my respects. But I would tell Ms. Freeland in a business meeting that you're going to have with her, the very integrity of the Liberal Party is at stake on this issue. Mm-hmm. Is the Liberal Party going to turn its back on the measures taken by its own former leaders on behalf of Canada to stand up for Canadian values when they came in conflict with the United States? Mr. Lester Pearson stood up for Canada when he went down to Philadelphia and condemned the United States bombing of the Vietnam War. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau stood up for Canadian values when he went to the the P5 capitals in 1983 to urge them to cease and desist the acceleration of the nuclear arms race, which was then underway. He stood up for Canadian values. When Jean Chrétien refused to have Canada join the United States in the disastrous Iraq War of 2003, he stood up for Canada. Is the Liberal Party today going to reject its own former leaders? Is it going to reject the call for humanity in understanding what the nuclear threat is? Is Ms. Freeland going to be mesmerized by NAFTA? Is NAFTA to control every part of our existence or relationship with the United States? It is nonsense. There is nothing in the record that shows the United States ever retaliated against Canada when Canada stood up for its own values on security questions. This is bogus. It's intimidation. And I think that the people who go to see Chrystia Freeland ought to lay it on the line with her.
You were first, and then you.
Thank you for your speech. Even big countries, Canada, U.S., Soviet Union, which have many safeguards, at least in theory, in place, they can break down. Look up Stanislav Petrov, if you have a moment, to see how close we came about 3 decades ago to nuclear war. My question is, proliferation is, we're at risk of ever greater proliferation, whether it's non-declared states like Israel or Iran or North Korea. The more hands nuclear weapons are in, the greater the risk that somebody is going to use them, whether they're nation states or someone who gets their hands on their stockpiles. My question is, what incentives can we put into place to make it not a rational choice for countries like Iran or North Korea to obtain nuclear weapons? Given the current stance of the world of geopolitics, it seems entirely, I don't want to say logical, but it does seem in a sense rational for them to develop their own deterrent power through obtaining nuclear weapons. How can we change that calculus so that it's not in their perceived self-interest to do so?
Can I?
So what common security can we have as opposed to nuclear weapons for our security?
Take that on? Can I start by taking that on? I mean, I think, I would love to talk about the sort of the whole alternative vision. And I know Robin Collins is there with a civil society statement signed by many organizations on how to make that shift to common security, from this competitive system to common security and sustainable peace. But I want to respond very specifically because it's very, very important, and this is something that civil society should really engage in, and that's with respect to what's happening now with Iran. It is very, very problematic to keep lumping Iran in with North Korea and others as part of the problem. Iran agreed to the most intrusive international inspection regime that has ever been agreed to by a country to verify the end of its nuclear weapons program, and 12 times the International Atomic Energy Agency certified that they were fully compliant with that deal. A deal that was enshrined in a binding UN Security Council resolution, which the United States has now violated by walking away from the agreement and by reimposing sanctions. But going beyond that, the United States is also threatening to impose secondary sanctions on all of the other countries who want to stick by the agreement. In other words, the United States is going to impose secondary sanctions on Europeans who continue to abide by a binding UN Security Council resolution. And yet still, Iran is abiding by the deal, because they understand that Europe is working hard. Of course, there's a huge debate in Iran. All the hardliners are saying, suckers, we told you this is what the United States would do. They're saying that to the moderates. But nonetheless, Iran is still abiding by the deal, and Europe is trying to find a way to insulate enough of its companies against secondary sanctions. It's also trying to find a way to make sure that Iran gets the economic benefits that it so desperately needs from the deal. So if we want to show countries that there is another way, we need to support Iran, and we need to make sure that our government, there was a big difference in the two statements, very interesting, between what the Prime Minister said and what Foreign Minister Freeland said. The Prime Minister, in his statement of support for the deal, ended that statement by saying, we continue to believe that the way forward with Iran is positive engagement, which is wonderful. What Chrystia Freeland did in the official statement that she... Okay, so have I been knocked off, or am I still... Okay, just to finish, what Chrystia Freeland said was she said she supported the agreement. Hurrah. But she went on to say that this whole litany of other criticisms of Iran, which are very unfair in many cases, and it's the American list. So what we need is to make it clear that we support the Prime Minister's approach, which is strong support for the deal, for Iran and Europe complying with the deal, and for Canada doing everything it can to promote positive engagement with Iran. Thank you.
Joe, did you want to add to that?
Well, I do, but I'll
Okay. Okay, Robin, one more question, and I think that's going to be your time.
One more question. Haven't even asked my first one.
Oh, no, first one.
I wanted to ask a question about political will, and in particular, the disconnect we see between polls showing significant opposition to nuclear weapons, even possession, let alone use of nuclear weapons in Canada and across many countries. Actually, not every country, but across many countries. So in some ways, public education has been working because people do know the dangers of these weapons. So I'm not to suggest that we should lower our education task, but for me the question is, how do we translate, public opinion, which exists already against nuclear weapons, to political will, so that countries like Canada can take positions, leading perhaps, or at least participating in moving the agenda along. So what generates political will? Is it public opinion, which is already on our side, or is it something else?
Thanks, Robin. Just a word on the previous question. First, I find the last two questions really profound questions that require us to think in kind of new ways. And as the Secretary General said in his agenda for disarmament that I referred to in my remarks, he said we have to find a new mindset, And I'm not absolutely certain what he means by that, except to recognize that the old mindset hasn't worked. We've got to find a way to make an impression on the development of public policy that is at once based ethically, humanitarian-based, and security-based, and in the interests of allegiance to the human rights agenda in a globalized world. That's why the subject of dealing with nuclear disarmament is so broad and so deep. And obviously, the abolition of nuclear weapons cannot take place in a vacuum. It needs a security architecture to sustain it, which brings us back to the widened agenda that Meta has set for this conference. So while I repeat my claim that nuclear weapons is the most terrible threat that the world faces, I reinforce the idea of how to get rid of them by saying that the public view, public understanding, political action has got to be based in a wider framework. And I think that if we can find a way to express the need for public interest to be served by a common security approach, which is the title of the Secretary General's document, we will make some gains. I've been dealing with this question for a long time on political will, and it always baffles me how we can there's lots of public education programs. Education is taking place certainly in the academic sphere in its various dimensions, but it's also taking place in civil society organizations. Many of the groups represented in this room are themselves engaged in education. The very act of holding events and so on helps to stimulate. So I don't think there's any magic formula. What we have to recognize that in this new mindset that I'm seeking, and I think the Secretary General is seeking, it's in a new atmosphere in the world. It's a world that's quite different from the 1980s. It was a more believing world. Today it's a much more cynical world, and a world that's rejecting. It's a world that's reacting. It feels disillusioned and so on. So, and there's lots to be disillusioned about because of poor performance of politicians. But I think we should try to keep focused and keep our own hope alive in recognizing that what we are doing is building a foundation in even getting out the word, pushing the Canadian government on its responsibilities to sign the Prohibition Treaty, building a stronger base of understanding of what true human security requires. It requires the elimination of nuclear weapons, and it requires climate protection, it requires health, it requires the range of things that are constantly threatening human security. I don't know how, Robin, to put this in a 30-second clip that CNN will carry. Now, you get my point. We got to go beyond CNN thinking in how to think and how to formulate and how to reach out to a world that is hurting. And for me, I think the human approach, the humanitarian base, is the strongest and most effective way of reaching into the public mind.
Thank you both. I think we've gone about 7 minutes over time. So I think we'll stop the questions now. We will have further chance in the breakout groups to carry on these thoughts and contribute more ideas. So thank you so much, Peggy, and thank you, Doug, for your amazing contributions. And we look forward to, and thank you for the questioners, and we look forward to further ideas and suggestions for action. Thank you.